begin tonight in James chapter number 1. James chapter 1. Look briefly at verses 2 through 4. These are verses that we've been looking at in our time together, thinking about what God is doing through the testings that come our way. It says in verse 2 of James chapter 1, "My brethren, count it all joy," or reckon it full joy, when you fall into divers temptations or various trials. Well, how is that? How so, we might ask? Verse number 3 answers that, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. We know that God is using each trial to build steadfastness into our lives. How is it that we can count it all joy? We can reckon it full joy because we know that God is using each trial to build steadfastness into our lives. But let patience, that is endurance, have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. The goal of all of this is maturity without lack. That is the goal. That is what God is doing. Spiritual maturity. We might say spiritual adulthood. So James tells us this is the sanctification process. This is what God does to address the faulty character in us. And that is, He turns up the heat in our lives, or allows the heat to be turned up in our lives. These fiery trials come in various ways. But we're to rejoice in them because this is the process by which God exposes and addresses our faulty character when we respond in faith. Let me take you over to chapter 5 because James is going to talk about this again. He talks about it in a number of places, as does Peter in his first letter. But verses 10 and 11 of James chapter 5, it says, "Take, my brethren, the prophets who have spoken in the name of the Lord for an example of suffering affliction and of patience," that endurance, that steadfastness. "Behold, we count them happy which endure." And it makes this statement, "You have heard of the patience of Job and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy." You have heard of the endurance of Job. Well, the book of Job is one that we're presently reading in. And each time we come to this book, we can anticipate the fact that God might help us understand a little more of what He's trying to say in this book. And I would just like to take some time tonight there, Job, right before Psalms. Turn back there now to the book of Job. And I want to talk to you tonight about integrity severely tested. This man who persevered that James alludes to in his writings, his 5th chapter of that early letter to the New Testament church. Job's usually thought of as the oldest book of the Scriptures. It is a combination of poetry and prose, which means there's poetic material, but there's also narrative material. There's instructional material. You know, those guys, the friends are talking to Job. Job is talking back to them. God speaks in the very end. It's the most severe test for the most godly man of that day. And part of the severity of Job's test is that it was unidentified. He did not know what God was doing. He had no answer. There was an unseen exchange taking place in heaven. And Satan was asking permission to test Job and then severely testing him. And God was the one that called Satan out and said, "Have you considered this man Job?" And so he did not have the answer as to what was going on through this severe trial. Let's reacquaint ourselves with that first chapter quickly and then just try to think about the book as a whole. And I think it might help us as we finish up reading the book, and maybe we'll come back to some of these things in the future. You're familiar with this chapter. It says there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. Okay, perfect and upright has to do with his character. It has to do with how he lived with men. So we raised the question, how is it that he was a man who was perfect and upright? Well, the answer to that is his relationship with the Lord. Look at the second part of the verse. He feared God. He reverenced God, and he eschewed evil, which basically means he turned down evil. So here's a man that has integrity and is a well-rounded man. That's the idea of perfection. He's perfect and upright in the sight of man. The reason for that is because he reverenced God. He feared God, and he turned down evil. He said no to evil. Well, there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had a large family. Had much of this world's goods. His substance also was 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she-asses, and a very great household. So that this man was the greatest of all the men of the east. And his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. You see, this a time of merriment, a time of joy. And verse 5 says, it was so when the days of their feasting were gone about that Job sent and sanctified them. He occupied a priestly role in this patriarchal day. He served in a priestly role for his family. He rose up early in the morning, offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, here's what he's thinking. It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts, and all of their merriment and all of their gathering there. So this is what Job did, it says continually. That sets up the story. Now there was a day when the sons of God came. We have now a view into heaven. Sons of God are the angelic beings, the messengers of God. Well, they came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, who is that fallen son of God as an angel, came also among them. Notice the Lord calls him out in verse number 7. The Lord said unto Satan, whence comest thou? Where'd you come from? Why are you here? And Satan answered the Lord and said, well, from going to and fro in the earth, from walking up and down in it. A picture of restlessness, a picture of the adversary, which is what the name Satan means. The adversary is making his way through the earth, walking up and down in it. The Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job? The Lord knew what the accuser was up to. He's saying, what about Job? That there is none like him in the earth. And now he says the same thing that was said earlier in verse number 1. The Lord says this about him. He is a man perfect and upright. And the reason that he is that kind of man in the society is because he fears God and he turns down evil. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made a hedge about him, about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? And thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. So why wouldn't he serve you? Verse 11, he says, but put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. The Lord said unto Satan, behold, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon him do not put forth thy hand. He put a limitation there. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. Now comes his affliction. Verse 13, there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. There came a messenger unto Job and said, the oxen were plowing, and the asses feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them, took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. First messenger. Messenger number 2, verse 16. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep, and the servants, and consumed them, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Messenger number 3, verse 17. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands and fell upon the camels and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Fourth messenger, while he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. Behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men. They are dead. and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. Here's a man living on this planet, living on this earth, who's connected to what's going on in heaven. Here's a man whose life is being put to the test as a result of communication between the adversary and God in heaven. Here's a man that's put to the test because God said, have you considered this man? God pointed out Job to Satan, the accuser. God allowed this testing by the accuser. The battleground between Satan and God is known to us, but unknown to Job. Let me give you this as a starter for us to begin to think through these things. Without surrendering His sovereignty, God allows us to be tested. And at times that is severe. Sometimes severely. Without surrendering His sovereignty, God is still in control. God is still seated on His throne. God is still ruling over all. God is still accomplishing His purposes, but He allows us to be tested, sometimes severely. We see that throughout the Scriptures, and in part of our character studies, what we've done, even as we came to Job, was to recognize that life after life in the Old Testament and the New Testament are marked by testing, hardship. We're told in principle that if we would live righteously, if we would live faithfully, we would suffer hardship. We never get used to that. We never invite that. But it is part of our lives as believers. And God is not surrendering His sovereignty in this, but God is actually sovereign in this, saying, hey, have you considered this one? Let me show you what it means for a man to reverence me, to turn down evil, to live with integrity, to live with uprightness. What happens? Well, what's happening here is Job's motive is called into question by Satan. The accuser says, listen, you've got him hedged about. You've given him abundantly. He's the richest man around. What is going on through this severe testing? Well, he's proving our motive in loving and serving him. Satan says, take away all of your blessings, touch his wealth, touch his health, and he'll curse you. You remember chapter 2, God gives him permission to touch his health. Touch his wealth, touch his health, and he will what? He will curse you. What was that? That was a test. God is proving our motive in loving and serving him. Remove the protective hedge that you have around him. You won't find him revering you anymore. You won't find him worshiping you anymore. Proving to the accuser that our allegiance is not based upon material and physical benefits. Now think about it. This is what's going on in Job's life. When you think about the tests that come into our lives, does not God use those tests to prove our motive in loving and serving him? As a testimony that our love does not wane, that our service does not wane, that we continue to love him and serve him because of our response to his grace in our lives. But he's also, as we've seen in James, he's strengthening our faith. Without surrendering his sovereignty, God allows us to be tested, and sometimes that's severely. It's painful. It can be people. It can be family. It can be, in this case, substance. Actually, it hit every part of Job's life, proving our motive in loving and serving him, but also strengthening our faith through the removal of material and physical benefits. The question that has to be raised is God enough? In this case, everything is taken. Is God enough for Job? Satan said, it's not going to happen. Let me at him, and you will find out. And yet we read at the end of the chapter that actually Job responded in a way that honored God. he was hurting. He was mourning. How could you not? But in that, he did not sin against God. So we saw there, and I think it's helpful for us, and God wants us to get this, is that Job's initial response was meek acceptance and mourning, right? Verses 20 to 22. A meek acceptance and mourning. Meekness has to do with responding aright to God's choices for our lives. Meekness is our right response to God's choices for our life. To have a meek spirit, to trust the Lord with our lives. He worships God. He surrenders to God. He takes a place of yieldedness before God, and he blesses God. It says he says, blessed be the name of the Lord. And the writer tells us in verse 22 that there was no sin in this case, and there was no charging God foolishly. I think we can use the word resignation. Resignation might come across sometimes as a very negative word, but to resign ourselves is to just trust the Lord. It's to go back to doing what we have been doing, and that's exactly what he did. After messenger brings him this terrible news, he trusts the Lord. You noticed over in chapter number 2, when Satan's allowed to touch him physically, what does his wife do in verse number 9? Then said his wife unto him, dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die. Well, his response to her is, thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, again it says, did not Job sin with his lips? What is his wife doing? We can paint all kinds of pictures of her. Probably she's looking and saying, why don't you just get this over with? Tired of watching you suffer. Right? You might as well die. That wasn't the right response, but you can appreciate the fact that there she is, watching her husband. You can appreciate the fact that right next to that it says, no, Job's heart was settled. Severely tested, and then tested some more. The things closest to him, 10 children gone. All that he had gone, and now his wife, for that matter, is what? Right? Nobody can do anything for him. In fact, everyone at this point is distanced from him. Very interesting, when we get to the end of the book, I was reading there earlier today, end of the book, everybody's gathering back around. God blesses him, everybody gathers back around. Something in Proverbs about that, isn't there? He's got these 4 men that address him throughout the book. His initial response was meek acceptance in the morning. Do you find sometimes, and I don't know if I can say this in a blanket way, but it seems very clear that God stabilized him, that there's a sense in which God allowed him, by his grace, a bit of insulation, because what is happening here is devastating. And sometimes I think we sense that. We sense the grace of God in our lives at the point in time when we should be shattered. We should be coming unwound. For me, the test comes later. When days pass and weeks pass and you're going, Lord, why did you let this happen? You know, you're examining your heart, you're examining your life, you're saying, I don't understand. Well, we're not alone in that, and here's another testimony from the Scriptures, and that is that Job's extended response was confusion and discouragement. Aren't you glad God gave us testimony of the most righteous man of the day, and he lets us know that as he worked through this, he was confused. He was discouraged, because we become confused. We become discouraged. We think, Lord, I have sought to honor you. Lord, I have sought to do what you tell Christians to do. Well, chapter 3 is basically Job bewailing his birth, and he goes on and on. I'm just going to give you the first 3 verses. After this, opened Job his mouth. This is chapter 3, verse 1. And cursed his day. And Job spake and said, let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man-child conceived. Let that day be darkness. Let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine upon it. He goes on and on and on. He curses the day that he was born. This is a story of unanswered agony. Unanswered agony. God, I just don't understand. You've allowed this, and I had been better had I never been born. I've experienced all these beautiful things in life, and now all of that at once is taken from me. A story of unanswered agony that was known to God. We need to get this. It was known to God. It was allowed by God. It was orchestrated by God. Initiated by God without explanation. Well, we can see why Job would cry out, stripped and lonely. He had no answer. Well, in chapter 4, we begin to see these friends come in. And a lot of things are written and said. This is an interesting book of the Bible, and I'm trying to study through it in my personal time, and I'm amazed at the variety of things, even when you say, what's the theme of the book? You get about a dozen answers to that. And what about these friends? You'll get a lot of answers to that too. But I think if you read carefully, you'll recognize that a lot of what the friends said was truth. Okay? Just the wrong application. It wasn't truth in application to Job at that point in time. So they were unhelpful to him. But I think we can think through this a little bit more and maybe understand. We've already read through 20 chapters of the book in our daily reading. Secondly, not only do we learn that without surrendering His sovereignty, God allows us to be tested at times severely, but we tend to reason and come to conclusions from a limited vantage point. And that's just the nature of who we are. We're trying to figure it out, and we reason about it, and these guys did that, and Job himself did that. And we come to conclusions from a limited vantage point. There is a doctrinal viewpoint shared in this book by Job and his friends. If you want to understand the doctrinal viewpoint that they shared, all you have to do is listen to the content of their lectures. Content of the things that they said. Here's the first thing that will come out clearly. And they believed, doctrinally, they believed that faithfulness to God is measured by reward and retribution. Now, if you read the book of Proverbs regularly, is that a Bible principle? It is. It is a Bible principle. Does God promise to reward faithfulness? He does. Does God promise to reward integrity? Yes. As a general principle, God blesses those that live in a way that honors Him. Well, as they gave their speeches, as Job evaluated where he was and responded to them, they were all thinking that faithfulness and integrity is rewarded by God and that unfaithfulness and flawed character is punished by God, which is a scriptural principle, but it's not a hard and fast truth always. And God wanted us to get this because God told us repeatedly in the first chapter this was not an issue of a lack of character or a lack of obedience. He's not punishing Job for something he did wrong. Okay? But that principle being in place, that normal principle being in place, is at the heart of the things that they said. Listen, you're in trouble and you're hurting and God, what did you do, Job? They take out the gloves, don't they? I mean, these guys, hard to listen to, they're hard to read. They pick up that principle and they said, there's got to be some unrighteousness in your life. Well, hardship and suffering is attributed to God as the one responsible. God is punishing you, Job. Well, that's not always the case. That proves, again, the inadequacy of human thinking. Actually, in this case, God had allowed Satan to afflict Job. So what happened here was that Job's friends labored to prove some iniquity in Job's life. Because that principle was in place, that faithfulness to God is measured by reward and retribution, they labored to prove that Job had done something wrong. There's got to be some unkindness in your life, some injustice in your life. There's some human failure in your life. 3 rounds of this with no proof. That was the challenge, wasn't it? This got to be true, and there's no proof. And Job maintained, right? Job maintained his innocence. No, I haven't done anything. That's what you're hearing, chapter after chapter, the whole middle section of the book. He maintained his innocence in the midst of intense suffering. No, it's not true. He refused to confess what he was not guilty of. Job's friends labored to prove some inequity in Job's life, and Job maintained his innocence in the midst of intense suffering. One writer says the men were right-hearted, but they were wrong-minded. They had a right heart. They wanted to help him. They were thinking wrong. Right-hearted and wrong-headed. Another writer says there's a no-holds-barred wrestling with questions about disturbing realities and inexplicable inequities, apparent injustices, and above all, the silence and the hiddenness of God. You're looking in, I'm looking in. Okay, you say you haven't done anything, and God took everything away, and God is not speaking to you, and God is not helping you, and God is not answering you, and God is not fixing the problem. You can understand how that principle in the mind continued to drive what was taking place. So, are there some conclusions that are made that we hear from a human perspective, from human rationale? What conclusions did they come to? I read some of this in Job's responses. Well, maybe God incorrectly thinks I'm guilty. It's a very human conclusion, but I can see readily how I could think that way. I think God missed something here. Now, all of our theology says otherwise, but I think we're in the middle of this buckling hardship. God overlooked something. Let me ask you a question. When you get to the end of the book, what does God make very clear? God doesn't overlook anything. I think when you get to those last chapters, if you can begin to connect together the conclusions that Job made and the answers that God gave, you'll recognize what happens in our lives. From a human vantage point, we're thinking, okay, Lord, maybe you incorrectly think I'm guilty. You missed something. God, in the end, says, no, actually, I don't miss anything. Well, maybe God treats the wicked and the righteous alike. How many Psalms do you read this in? I know there's one in the 30s, and there's one in the 40s. I should have looked them up today. There's 3 or 4 Psalms where the psalmist says what? What is going on? You're rewarding the bad guy. Punishing what? The good guy. Let me ask you again, was Job innocent? It says he didn't sin. It says he didn't bring this on himself. Sometimes it's hard to get our mind around that, aren't we? How could God allow such devastation for somebody who didn't have it coming? You can imagine the human rationale. You can hear these men talking. You can hear Job responding. The conclusions they came up with was, hey, maybe God incorrectly thinks that I'm guilty, or maybe God treats the wicked and the righteous alike. Well, God is working out his eternal purpose, which is to bring himself glory. Okay? And sometimes he works that out through what seems to be exceeding blessing to wicked people and exceeding hardship to those who are seeking to live righteous. Another conclusion, third conclusion, that I think might help us with the book and also help us with ourselves as we think about our test. Maybe God blesses the wicked and punishes the righteous. Again, you see it in the Psalms repeatedly. These are conclusions that we make from our perspective. These are things you hear from Job and his friends. Maybe God incorrectly thinks I'm guilty. Maybe he overlooks something here. Well, maybe God treats the wicked and the righteous alike, or maybe even this. Maybe God blesses the wicked and punishes the righteous. The psalmist says, how long is this going to go on? This isn't right. Well, Job uttered some rather bitter accusations against God, didn't he? Talked rather straightforwardly. But as he kept moving forward in his thinking, and I think it's part of the beauty of the book, he's not satisfied with his conclusions. You ever find yourself there? You got stuff going on in your soul. I'm not sure if you're saying them to God or not, but you come to a conclusion and then later you think better of it. I know that's not true. I know I'm not thinking right. So as he kept moving in his thinking, he was not satisfied with his conclusions based upon what he knew about God and what he knew about himself. An oft-repeated theme, I say again, in the Scriptures, particularly in the book of Psalms. One of the things that Job concludes is that wisdom was unknowable to him. Okay, wisdom is something that's mysterious. It's something that I cannot know. He understood and made statements in regards to God choosing to share what is available, only sharing what is available. At the heart of things, Job longs for his relationship with God to be right. This man of integrity and character is a man that James says endured. He endured the adversity. He remained under that hardship. He was steadfast. He persevered. He continued to advance under the pressure with the hope, insight, and confidence in God that he would bring everything right. Well, when you get to those final chapters, and we don't have the leisure of reading those tonight, I want to give you these in advance because we'll come to them. Well, first of all, God's answer was, he didn't ask about the facts of Job's situation or answer his questions. They didn't have a conversation where God said, okay, Job, give me all those details again. Let's talk through your hardship. He didn't do that. That's already where Job's focus was. He didn't ask about the facts of Job's situation, and he didn't answer his questions. Now, that can be very frustrating to us. God allowed what he deemed best, and he did not stoop to answer all the details of the whys of what Job was going through. He rather walked Job through the realities of who the all-wise God is. And I'm so thankful that we have this book, and I'm so thankful that when we come back to it year after year, we can stop again and go, okay, because I'm still asking why. I'm still reasoning from a human vantage point. I'm still thinking it shouldn't be like this. And what God is going to do in every case is he's going to remind us of who he is. He's going to say things to Job like, where were you when I created everything? And he just goes on, chapter after chapter. God is talking about these things that are completely outside of any knowledge that Job has. He's reminding Job, you know what? I wasn't looking for counsel from you when I did any of that. That you're asking the question as to why you're thinking that I might have overlooked something. You're thinking that I might be rewarding wickedness. The problem is you don't know who you're talking to and who you're thinking about. Because this God cannot reward wickedness. This God cannot lose sight of anything. So God hones in and continues to feed Job's soul to bring him back where he needed to be and resting in the Lord. And then he blessed him again exceedingly, as we see at the end of the book. God basically says, and I'm trying to put this in a nutshell because there's much more there, as you know, and lots of verses and a lot of content there, but God basically says that He creates and takes care of everything. You see the order. You see the oversight. You watch every day dawn. You watch the sun come up. You see the stars in the sky. You see the moon. You see the animals. You watch what's happening. I created all of that, and I'm taking care of all of that. Now, Job, you're one guy in one place. You are going through a severe test. God didn't make light of that. But Job was so focused on that, God was saying, now what you need to do is turn that focus and look at the one that has allowed this for you. And to understand that every single day I am providing every single thing. I'm holding it all together. He creates and takes care of everything. Everything you see that's ordered, God ordered it, right? Everything that's in place is because of God's oversight. So think in terms of order. And then wed this to it, because this is also what God lets Job know. He does not eliminate chaos. Okay? Although He creates and takes care of everything. Cosmos is order. Okay? But at the same time, God wants Job to know and wants us to know He does not eliminate the chaos, but He uses it for His glory and for our good. Storms, earthquakes, right? All of the things that He reviews and talks about, events, people, floods, disaster. God doesn't eliminate the chaos completely, but He uses it for His own glory and for our good. So Job had choices to make just like we do. I don't suspect that Job nailed this down one morning and everything's great. I think the whole time through the whole test, he was having to turn his faith back to his God. I expect that as God was teaching him, I expect as these men were talking to him, some of those things stung him. But I think God was also combing some of the tangles out of his own thinking and recognizing that he had placed God in a place very small and very limited. And his hardship was ever before him, but he needed to make the choice each and every day to, by faith, trust the Lord that he hadn't overlooked anything, and he would accomplish his purposes. We have to learn to cast our care upon the Lord. Folks, we feel like we can't handle it, where we're right where we need to be. That's exactly right. You can't change a soul. It's not our mission. It's God's mission. And we have to give this over to Him and trust the fact that when God accomplishes His purposes, that He will do it right, that He will glorify Himself, and He will accomplish what He wants for our good. Now, we're all these years, some date this book back to 2000 B.C. That's a long time ago. We pick it up every year, and it's living truth that comes right to where we live, doesn't it? Right to where we are. Let's praise the Lord. Father, thank you for our time tonight as we've been thinking about our faulty character. We've been thinking about severe trials. We've been thinking about faith and our need to constantly be communicating faith and trust and confidence. We need rest. We frankly don't understand. We have the same theological grid in place. As we try to live lives that honor you, as we seek to live lives that you can bless, and we're confronted and challenged with the chaos, and we think it's not supposed to be this way. And yet, Father, we learn from Job that hardship's not always punishment or chastening. It's not always a corrective. It's not always limited to us. in the things that you're accomplishing. We need to come back to you, not only day after day, but many times a day sometimes, and just give it over to you again. Yield ourselves to you again. I want to praise you and thank you for who you are, and thank you that you haven't left us to guess. You've revealed yourself in your word. Help us to learn to ask why less. Focus on who you are, who you've revealed yourself to be. We praise you tonight in Christ's name.